Dear viewers across the world, most welcome to my channel. NAGA World Conflict Zone. Context: how media bias protect Israel and demonizes Palestinians. Israel began the most recent bout of violence against the Palestinians after its courts ruled the Palestinian civilians should be forcefully expelled from their homes in East Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in order to increase the Jewish presence in the occupied city. Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims protesting against the imminent evictions were last month attacked by Israeli soldiers, police, and settlers. A move so outrageous that further protests erupt throughout the occupied territories, inside Israel and around the world. These demonstrations escalated as Israel increased its violent response. However, while war crimes are being committed by Israel's heavily armed soldiers, police, and racist settlers, many mainstream new media outlets, including the BBC, are complicit as they dilute Israel's offensive violence and exaggerate Palestinians' defense response. Israeli police shoot and kill Palestinian citizens of Israel who were protesting against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's ethnic cleansing policies in Sheikh Jarrah. But those killings were minimized by much of the mainstream media. The issue of the media's glaring bias can be seen in May 2012 BBC story on how Israeli authorities and settlers responded to unarmed Palestinian protest. The story was headlined Israel declares emergency in Lord as unrest spread, but it does not even address that angle until the 14th paragraph. Although the story was supposed to be about Palestinian citizens of Israel rising up in the protest against the Tel Aviv government's violence, it was really a public relations exercise that reflects Israel's effort to dilute its killing of Palestinians and exaggerate the death of the Israeli Jews. The BBC story focus was buried under 13 paragraphs of propaganda that had already been heavily reported and attempted to blame the latest violence on the Hamas rocket fired from Gaza. In fact, while Israel killed more than 250 Palestinians during last month, violence Hamas rockets only killed a handful of Israelis. That is a news story the BBC obviously does not want to write. The BBC characterized the Lot protest as a rioting by Israeli Arab as part of a wider conflict between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants. When the story finally got around the describing what happened in Lord, it disclosed that an unidentified and undescribed Palestinian men have died during unrest in the city. The BBC uses the passive word died to describe Palestinians' death without attributing blame, while using the more aggressive killed to describe the death of Israel, blaming Hamas and Palestinians. This subtitle and subtle bias is sufficient when reading the story. The story also added the setup for false charges of anti-Semitism, quoting Israeli media that synagogues and several personal, presumably Jewish businessmen have been set on fire. There was no mention of the destructions of Palestinians' business and homes when they were confronted by Israeli soldiers, police and settlers. The Lord protests were significant because they showed that concern over the issue of Israel's war crimes, which are now being investigated by the United Nations Human Rights Council, is not restricted to foreign critics. According to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Israeli police, in law with backing from soldiers and armed settlers, were the ones involved in a full-scale riot against civilians. Calling the Palestinians' protest a riot helps justify Israel's violence against its own citizens, even though they already live in an apartheid-like society where the Christian and Muslims are discriminated against by law. The BBC story twice mentioned that an Israeli father and his 16-year-old daughter were killed by a Hamas rocket. So the media, the BBC in the cases, writes a story about attacks on Palestinian citizens of Israel by packing with it extraneous details about how Hamas rockets took the life of two Israelis. What the BBC failed to report in 40 plus paragraphs of propaganda disguised as news was that the Israeli military censors every story about the violence reported. Every new agency in Israel and the occupied territories. Reporters have to keep the Israelis happy, otherwise they could be expelled from the country. Something many Western media outlets fight by hiring pro-Israel Jewish journalists who lives inside Israel. Most journalists do not actually report from the occupied territories and instead rely on information supplied to them by sources, including Israel's military. That system helps Israel exaggerate its claim of innocent and promote the propaganda story that the Palestinians are the bad guys. Anyone who reads the BBC story can easily see how the facts are skewed in Israel's favor and how the biased news media is failing in the responsibility to report to the truth. So, this is the reliable news agency BBC. How and where we can go, because if this media is biased, then nowhere going.